Thank you all so much for joining today. I am Brandy Noneke, the director of the CITRIS Policy Lab, headquartered at UC Berkeley, but we also operate on the campuses of UC Davis, UC Merced, and UC Santa Cruz. You're joining workshop 2 out of our 4-part workshop series on science communication and policy impact. We have 2 more upcoming workshops. Workshop 3, Pitching the President, and how you can provide effective guidance to policymakers. And we will also have a writing workshop where we will guide you through the process of writing a policy memo. In today's workshop, you're going to hear from Eric Martin, and Eric will guide you through writing a policy memo for the Federation of American Scientists Day One Project. So today we'll set you up for essentially what does it take to write a policy memo? What should your priority action be? How can you be most effective? In the next workshop, we're going to put all of that to action and actually help you draft out that policy memo. The final workshop, engaging with legislative and regulatory processes. I'm sure many of you on the call have seen several notices of proposed rulemaking or requests for comments, requests for information from federal agencies or state agencies. We'll provide you guidance on how to provide effective recommendations, key insights, action strategies to policymakers so that they can act on your research. So if you could please register for those workshops, you can register for them at citrispolicylab.org/SCPI workshops. I want to mention that CITRIS Policy Lab at CITRIS and the Banatow Institute is here as a resource for you in helping you to craft your broader impact strategy within especially your federal grant proposals. We can help you develop appropriate policy recommendations for both the public and private sector, help you strategize appropriate methods to communicate your research, and assist in actually writing those policy memos and briefs. We've also assisted researchers in drafting white papers, op-eds, one-pagers, slide decks, and other types of outreach materials, whatever is necessary to best ensure that your research gets into the hands of those who can make very consequential decisions. If you want to reach out to me to inquire about these services, you can email me at the email address located on the slides. I will mention also that these slides will be made available on our webpage for this program. Also, I'm the host of TecHype, a video and podcast series where we debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies and the laws and policies that shape them. Our TecHype show has covered everything from quantum computing to simple forms of machine learning to frontier models. One of our most popular pieces of content that we produce are the TecHype TLDRs, Too Long Didn't Read, where we analyze and summarize the most prominent bills to date that will affect how we govern emerging technologies. I'm sure many of you don't share the same enthusiasm as me as a policy wonk of poring over pages and pages of legalese language, but I do. And I'll break it down for you in short videos that are less than 10 minutes to provide you insight on what does this bill actually entail and what does it mean for society. So I hope that you will check out our series at techhype.org. A little bit of housekeeping today. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat throughout. And as they pop up, we might stop and actually address that question. We will ensure that there is a dedicated Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And then also you can upvote somebody else's question by clicking that thumbs up icon. Hover over that smile icon, you'll see it below. That way we'll get a better sense of whether or not there's a growing consensus among you that one of the questions is really an important question that you all want to hear about. So I am delighted to introduce Eric Martin, and Eric Martin is Senior Fellow at the Federation of American Scientists and Chief of Staff of a new climate solutions initiative under Renaissance Philanthropy. He has worked across government, industry, and civil society, focusing on emerging technologies and the public interest. He previously worked as senior advisor to the CTO of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, where he helped establish the new Office of Technology and advised on investigations and cases regarding tech companies. Before joining the FTC, he helped launch the Day One Project and the Impact Fellowship Program at the Federation of American Scientists, creating new programs and products also at Unity.com, the largest real-time 3D graphics engine, and managed federal and state policy efforts for media policy at the Democracy Fund's Digital Democracy Initiative. He's also served as policy advisor at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy during the Obama administration. Eric's expertise spans science and technology, policy, program management, public engagement, and generally building new things, which many of us as academics are very, very familiar with. He holds a master's in social science of the internet from the University of Oxford, where he studied as a Clarendon Scholar. So I am incredibly honored to have you with us today, Eric. And with that, I will pass the sharing baton over to you.
Amazing. Thank you for that intro. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. And we have some good material to cover. So let me share here now. All right, and that's coming through all right.
It's awesome. Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. All right. But yeah, so hello from, well, it's not really cold in Washington, D.C., but I'm at the American Geophysical Union building right now, which for some reason is frigid. But I split my time working on this new climate initiative, but also with the Day One Project, which we'll get into a little bit in just a second. So just by way of background, Day One Project, this is a initiative that is housed at the Federation of American Scientists. FAS, for those not familiar, is a think tank organization based in DC, but has a pretty interesting story in its own right. During the sort of period following the Manhattan Project, 1945, a number of scientists who were involved in the project formed an organization called the Federation of Atomic Scientists. And it was in part a response to the realization that suddenly this technology was created and there were monumental impacts and concerns for humanity, and the scientific community was not prepared to inform and educate policymakers about, how it should be managed, how it should be addressed, how the risks should be understood, all of these kinds of things. And so over time, the Federation of Atomic Scientists became the Federation of American Scientists and sort of grew in scope to be an organization dedicated towards providing sort of scientific and technical expertise on policy ideas and topics and issues, and putting ideas out there in the world that are based in sort of robust science and technology expertise. So that was, better part of over 60, 70 years ago. We, in the 2020, 2019, 2018 period, in the run-up to the 2020 election, a number of us who had served in the Obama administration had come to sort of a set of insights or perspective about why it is that a lot of the time the kinds of recommendations that are made by think tanks and often academics don't necessarily translate into material that policymakers use and certainly then turn into either law or regulation or what have you. And so sort of thinking on those insights and the experiences that we had working primarily at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where often, we would get a report from an outside group that would sort of say, hey, here are all these problems with X, Y, or Z, topic or issue or government program, but it wouldn't necessarily provide tactical ideas about who should do what specifically to fix or ameliorate or somehow improve the situation. It would give sort of like broad diagnostic, information about like all the things that are wrong, but like, okay, what do you want me to specifically do? How much is it going to cost? What part of what agency really needs to drive this? What's stopping them? Like these kinds of things were often difficult to get. And so we started the Day One Project initially as sort of like an activity of, more or less like friends and family of people who had ideas that they thought could be important to have ready to go for a transition process, recognizing that the presidential transition period is one of the most productive sort of policy making and agenda setting periods in sort of the American political, policy process. And so we stood up the Day One Project at the Federation of American Scientists. There was good mission alignment there, and started publishing Day One Project memos targeted at the transition period and targeted towards, specific parts of government where we thought, there was real possibility to make meaningful change. Let me just pause there. Everyone can still hear me okay? Or like...
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. So that is the origins of the Day One Project. A lot of success stories came out of that effort. Later on, I'm going to share a document that actually has quite a few examples of different implementation successes from different Day One memos. Two that stand out to me that I like to share are ARPA-H, Advanced Research Project Agency for Health, which was started as a Day One memo Michael Stebbins and Geoffrey Lynn put together, and ultimately was, Biden called for its creation in his first speech to Congress, and it's received appropriations twice now, and has been codified and is up and running, and is a really exciting success story about a new government agency or sub-agency that is dedicated towards addressing, essentially market failures in the kinds of drugs that we try to, or the kinds of diseases that we actually try to find cures and treatments for. And another example is the U.S. Digital Corps, which is a new federal program that was stood up. It was written as an idea first by Nick Sinai and Chris Kwong to essentially create like in a sense, like an AmeriCorps, but for young technical people who wanted to serve in government and do public service and not necessarily jump right out of their computer science program into the private sector. But, the federal IT workforce is unfortunately, it's aging out and lacks a lot of young people coming into it, and lacks sort of like incentives for young people to sort of see a career trajectory there. And so the U.S. Digital Corps was stood up as a way to attract really talented young technologists and place them into different agencies where there's need for their expertise, and for them to sort of have a onboard into federal service. So those are two examples. Again, I'll share a document that has a bunch more. This is basically what the Day One Project does. It's, a platform for developing policy. It is often our role in taking on a Day One idea or memo is then finding connections and people who are in government or have previously served in government who can take that idea and review it, give feedback on it, and give credibility to it and vouch for it, and find pathways for it to sort of progress. And of course, dissemination and how that idea is positioned to capitalize on a moment. And thinking about, what are the key windows and moments that happen in the policymaking process that are incredibly important to work backwards from when you're strategizing on how to actually make something happen. So, well, this is more or less what I just said, so we'll just skip that. For the Day One project that we're running currently, we have a number of different sort of umbrella categories. Right now, it's fallen into these buckets: energy and environment, R&D, innovation, competitiveness, which is a mouthful, and includes most things that sort of fall under the R&D enterprise outside of energy and environment, or sort of like hard technology and AI related investments, and as well as things that are sort of in the how do we ensure American competitiveness around things like high skilled immigration and some of these categories. If there's an other category, it's really that one, but there's a lot there. Emerging technologies and AI, which has sort of both the dual focus of building on the FAS legacy of concern and sort of risk spotting, looking at how do we mitigate against harm and risks around emerging technologies, as well as how do we invest in meaningful breakthroughs that actually do contribute to improving people's lives in meaningful ways, and where there is like genuine promise for things like AI to actually help people. Government capacity, which is an often overlooked sort of category of government policy, but this is really like, how do you actually help the government do what it does, improving its capacity to act, changing processes that have maybe stymied activity or action, changing bad incentives that unfortunately inhibit good things from happening. How do you like create better oversight for processes that you think need to happen? And then final category of global security, which builds on FAS's tradition of nuclear proliferation and sort of watchdog activities to think about what are the potential harms that we need to be mitigating across nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, biorisks, et cetera, from a global security perspective. So we will get to the policy toolkit and the memo in a sec, but just for those who are interested, and I would very much love more Day One submissions. We still have an open call that is up that you are by all means welcome and encouraged to submit the ideas that you're workshopping in this series to that open call, and then we can refine them into Day One memos. Right now, we're pretty late in the sort of Day One memo development process, but the key, sort of theme, I guess, of the Day One project is, take an idea anytime if it seems actionable and relevant, and to not just turn ideas away because of where we are in the process that we're running. So if you have a good idea, like, it is not too late to put it in and for us to potentially support it and publish it. If you go to the FAS website and the Day One project in particular, this is what you'll see. There's these different categories that we talked about. And then you can submit your idea by clicking on one of those categories, and then you have to go and hit apply for this position, which is silly because you're not applying for a position, but is a function of the intake system that we are using, that we cannot edit that text. But if you apply, then you can provide your information and give some of the background that we need to sort of assess these ideas and let our team review and reach out if we think it's promising. So what is a Day One memo? Again, like, the insight here was we need short, specific, actionable ideas that a policymaker who is coming into government or is already in government can use to not only like give themselves some ideas about things that they could potentially act on, but also they can share easily with other key stakeholders who will be able to understand the idea quickly, and not have to sort of try to become an expert on it right away. These are ideas that we usually spend, a few weeks to months refining with the authors that we work with. It really depends on sort of how specific and targeted, or like some ideas are like very specific, like here is like one language change that you can make in this rulemaking process, or in this, rule, or one particular interagency committee that could be stood up that would address this coordination problem, or those kinds of things. And those do not necessarily require that much finessing. And then some are like cross-government agendas for advancing, X topic. And there's a lot of different pieces that it takes us a while to sort of suss out which things should we really prioritize, which things should we maybe cut out, and that sort of thing. But our team usually works pretty closely with authors to hone those things. Again, no limit on the number of proposals that we're accepting. It's just a matter of our team reviewing and feeling confident an idea has potential, even if it's not perfect. And then, so there's sort of like a rough 10 to 15 hours of expected workload to take an idea and really refine it. But your mileage may vary. You may already have an idea that's mostly written. So. Okay, so now this is like more fun stuff, which is actually putting together a good memo. Some of this may be overlapping content with some of the other things that I think you're covering in this workshop series. But if it is, then great. More sort of like brain juice. So one thought experiment that we would often be posed at OSTP, which wasn't necessarily always a thought experiment, is if you had 15 minutes with the president, or in the near term, perhaps a newly that should not say necessary. Well, reelected. That needs to be edited. But newly elected president, what is the one thing that you would ask them to do or change or not do? Oftentimes, people don't necessarily have like an idea ready to go. And in the transition window, you really want to think about what should that idea be, because this is, again, a prime moment to put ideas out there, to start socializing them, to get them into the agenda setting mix. Day one memo, it contains pretty basic pieces, ideas to be concise. There's a summary, there's a challenge section, challenge and opportunity. There's a plan of action section. There's a conclusion. And then usually we also try to include an FAQ, which is, questions that you anticipate people having about how much it might cost, who might be opposed to this idea and why, specific sort of details on whatever plan of action you've laid out. Sort of thinking of the FAQ as like antibodies for your memo against attack, right? It's like, how can you anticipate the kinds of things that people might say that would dismiss your idea and say, no, thought about some of those things. We do take those ideas, those criticisms seriously, or some of them, and here's our thinking. So you want to be really action oriented in a short policy memo. You want to say, these people should do X in order to address Y problem. This agency should do this action in order to solve this problem. You want to be able to point to who does what, for what reason, for what outcome. You want the bottom line up front. If you're giving this to policy people, the policy person you're giving it to, they may be an expert, or they may work directly in the thing that you're focused on, but often they need to get other people's buy-in. They need to sort of get people aware about what the idea is, and they will not be experts. And you need to be able to convince people through the writing that this is something that's compelling and urgent and meaningful. What is, in clearest terms, the win here for the American public? And then there's like the hair on fire problem. If you are a policymaker in office, especially if you are somewhere like the White House, there are a million problems that you could be working on at any moment. And there are only so many days, and there are always things beyond your control that come up that you wind up working on as well, emergencies and contexts and whatever, ephemera. So convincing someone that there is a reason that this should be part of the priority of things that an administration wants to get done is key. And that's all part of the framing challenge. So again, you want to scope exactly what it is that you're trying to solve and why it is that this is like the right intervention or solution. You want to, as much as possible, also give data and evidence and citation that demonstrates that what you're saying isn't totally crazy. If you're proposing, some kind of rulemaking process or a new loan granting process at an agency, you want to be able to say, this other agency has done something similar, whether in the US or maybe elsewhere in the country or in the world. And if possible, say, and it had these impacts, and we actually know that it was, successful in some set of criteria. Or if you can't do that, you try to find like the closest possible sort of analogous example so that you can give some confidence that what you're saying isn't like totally crazy or made up in terms of potential solution. And also data in terms of the scale of the problem that you're trying to address. Why is this really meaningfully impacting people's lives? And a good example of this is like there's a day one memo that we did last time around the organ donor waitlist and kidney disease in particular in this country. It's cost taxpayers well over like $100 billion a year. And it is something like one person gets added to the kidney donor waitlist every 10 minutes. It's incredibly expensive for the country. And of course, like many people are often waiting years to get an organ. And we had a memo by Jennifer Erickson that proposed a number of changes to the way that HHS contracts vendors, which essentially have monopolies over different parts of the organ donor process. And they just a few weeks ago, HHS actually awarded new grants that are competitive across multiple vendors instead of the old way that they were doing it. That was highly monopolistic. And that is an example where she just sort of had very compelling numbers throughout. And she's been working on it for years, and she was working on it even when I was at OSTP. But that day one memo became like a sort of document of truth that she was able to share around and get more people bought in. Again, address precedents, sort of touched on that as giving sort of examples that you can build on, but you want to be able to speak to where else does this exist or what can we build on to make something successful. And of course, you want to be able to say, what is the resulting outcome that would be better? What does that look like? What does that different world look like? And also like present things in sort of a risk frame where it's not like in many cases, like the status quo may just be maintained if we don't act in the way that you're proposing. In other cases, it may be true that there is a risk of not taking an action or there is a cost, and you can sort of spell that out clearly. In the sort of plan of action section and thinking, again, being specific, like which agency, which office, which part of Congress, who needs to do the thing. You want to be specific about what kind of action you think would be appropriate. And you can always present things in terms of ideally there's a law, but if there is not going to be a law, then we should have an executive order, and the executive order should say this agency should start this process to solve this problem. We'll go through a much longer list of sort of like specific policy tools, but you want to sort of like spell out what is the process that you're talking about. You obviously want to try to have some rough ballparks and thinking around numbers and cost. The more fine-tuned, the better, but you just need to be able to give people something that is based on something, especially if you're going to need appropriations. You're wasting an appropriator's time if you can't tell them how much an idea is going to cost. Like, it's not going to go anywhere. And then thinking about who needs to be bought into the idea, there's sort of two ways of thinking about this. First of all is like sort of the current landscape of stakeholders relevant to an idea. Who has a role that they currently play in terms of regulating a particular issue or overseeing a particular grant program or what have you, and which organizations outside the government also pressure them or rely on them or are antagonistic towards them. And then another way to think about this is also who should be in government or what positions should exist or which position or person or authority should be relevant to this process that currently isn't or currently doesn't exist. And is that part of your pitch? Is that there should be someone who is responsible for doing X? And then, of course, you want to think about like, how does this fit into priorities that a current administration has laid out? So yeah, this is just like a little exercise. You want to be able to summarize these things concisely. And again, these kinds of questions can be addressed in like an FAQ section of a good memo, but you're going to want to come prepared to take criticism seriously and not just be like dismissive of it in a memo, but to say, we've really thought through all the reasons that someone would be opposed to this. We understand why they would be opposed to this. And here's why we think that this is still the correct course of action. And these are some of the kinds of questions that you want to be prepared to address. I think in particular, what is the first step and why start there is you should think about it as like a policymaker. This is a terrible analogy and maybe should not be used, but if you thought of a policymaker as like an artist, like often it's like you don't want them just staring at a white piece of paper because it's like paralyzing. Like, okay, there's a problem. What do I do? You need to give someone like the first step. If it's a rulemaking process, who initiates the rulemaking? What is the first step? Is the first step we need a line item in the next, president's budget that will call for X dollars at Y agency? Is the first step we need an interagency working group on X topic that is going to identify ways that other agencies could act on this issue? You want to try to avoid plans about making plans, but it's still important to sort of drive coordination. So again, giving people a first step, something to hold on to and get started. And also on the last bullet, like, what does a less ambitious version look like? This I think can be, it's tough for me. I think it could be tough for academics because often it feels, well, it's like killing your darlings. It's like killing your child of like, I don't want the idea to be watered down because then it's not even going to do the thing that I believe needs to be done, or it's inadequate, or why would we try to do something that's not going to fully solve the problem? And those can all be like completely fair perspectives. At the same time, government is really, really hard, and thinking about what is the more likely possibility that could be reached for, if it is like just a little regulatory sandbox to test out a different way of regulating some, part of technology or government. If it is a smaller grant program or a prize competition, that's not a full-on like, large-scale federal grant program, but is like, hey, we've got $5 million, $10 million, and we can launch a prize competition to identify solutions in X problem. And we won't have to be, spending as much as we would with a whole giant grant program through a prize competition approach. And in some ways, it may actually be a smarter use of money and get better outcomes, but often might cost less, which is also great. And this is just like a great sort of summary line to keep in your head. Like, policy is movement in a direction for a reason. This is a great paper if you want to check it out. And then this is just a line that my boss at OSTP would often use, Tom Khalil. People develop an implicit or explicit sense of what in their environment is fixed and what they view as potentially changeable. And the reality is, many of the things that make up the status quo are like the result of human activity or inaction and are actually potentially changeable. And so, bearing in mind that actually, like many parts of the policy apparatus, all policy was written by someone at some point. It can be rewritten. It's like a slightly hopeful sort of take on bureaucracy and government. So this is, and I mentioned I have a document that actually I'll give to you all that provides all of this in sort of a more structured format. But again, thinking about like specific policy tools and levers, obviously you of course have legislation, which is often what people jump to, is we need a new bill or a new law. Often that is the thing that would be like the most ambitious way to solve a problem and the most sustainable long-term way to do it. Sometimes it's the only way to do it. If you're thinking of going the legislation route, in your memo, you want to, as much as possible, try to include the parameters of the language that you want, or even draft some of the language that you want. And I have some templates for that in the document I mentioned. There's also executive actions, executive orders, presidential memorandums, OMB guidance, Office of Management Budget. EOs, unlike law, obviously can be much more easily challenged in court. They don't have the same weight as law. They often have to sort of adhere to existing authority in existing law. But at the same time, they can also be tools for imperfect solutions or for getting specific agencies to start on processes that they have not previously started on. For instance, early in the Biden term, there was an executive order around market concentration and monopoly issues, and that spurred a lot of sort of productive energy in the antitrust agencies, one of which I was at, the Federal Trade Commission. You have, of course, regulation, rulemaking, standards. Standards should not be overlooked. They're like an incredibly important way of sort of shaping markets and creating incentives. Treaties, eliminating, restructuring organizations. Again, thinking about the incentives that drive certain problems. The creation of the United States Digital Service was hugely important in the Obama term. For initially, that team was stood up to solve the fact that healthcare.gov was a disaster of a website. And then it expanded its scope significantly and became a real sub-agency in order to provide other agencies with, significantly better capacity to deliver service digitally, to have better websites, to have better sort of delivery mechanisms, to do, data analysis better, all of these kinds of things. And one of my favorites is like adding a specific idea or action to an existing policy vehicle, like hitching your car to a moving train. It is always worthwhile, especially if you want to go the legislative route on an idea, to think about, okay, it is very rare for Congress to pass a bespoke law about a specific issue. It is much more common that provisions are added on to much larger laws. For instance, the National Defense Authorization Act is like a defense, the authorizing bill for the vast majority of our defense agencies and security agencies. And that bill almost always passes. I'm pretty sure it has always passed for quite a while. It is a reliable bill that comes up for reauthorization. And so thinking about ways that you could attach things to some of the categories of that bill is always like, an activity in this domain. There's a similar bill for agriculture. There's a similar bill for education. Big bills that authorize large parts of government that happen on a regular cadence every year or every few years. This is just like my quick list of things that a good idea needs to have. I think it's really important to think about like the potential customer for an idea. So when you're writing, who is the person in the seat of the relevant position of power that you want that idea to reach? And if they read it, would they be convinced or not? Or if they would be offended, who is the person who sits in one seat above them who could be convinced? What are the policy windows that you can plan backwards from and think about as like the vehicles to attach your idea to? And try to have some model of the probability of those different vehicles being likely or unlikely. I think we mentioned like data and evidence. You can also draw on like anecdotal experience for why something is broken or what might need to be changed. I think we covered most of this. Setting goals is definitely a useful thing to include, even if they are somewhat straw man goals, but it gives a sense of like meaningful direction and accountability. Where, sometimes you have like interagency groups that are stood up in government and it's not really clear what the goals of their activity are. It's just like, we're here to talk about our problems every once in a while, but creating goals about like changing a number of people served through a certain thing or how a grant works or delivery or whatever is always useful. And then clarifying detail around specific authorities. So if you're proposing like a new regulation around something in privacy or, some specific process we have one memo right now I'm working on that's about a new FDA pathway for reauthorizing generic drugs for use in other diseases that they're not necessarily authorized for. Like clearly spelling out for the reader, like, what is the existing authority and why is it inadequate? And what is the specific authority that needs to exist? And, being able to like point to those things in a memo is hugely important. I think,
Eric, I actually have a question for you. Oh. Yes. So if you go back, one of these bullet points stands out to me more than the others, and that is number 3. How much does it cost? Is there an initial cost and then a recurring annual cost? When we're deep into thinking about how our research impacts policy, typically the last thing we're going to think about is the cost associated with that. However, it's one of the most important. And getting that stakeholder on board who essentially has the power of the purse to be able to act on it is very, very critical to the success of your proposal. Can you talk a little bit more about how to do that strategically and how do you, right? Because that's the first pushback you're going to get is, well, we don't have the budget. This is a very important challenge, but we're already strapped. We don't have the budget to be able to address this. So how can we, retort back to them? Well, I've actually thought that through.
Yeah. So cost is for sure often the hardest sort of barrier for a lot of ideas. There's sort of two ways I think to go about it. One is to present a credible argument about the cost of not doing your idea, if relevant. Like, is there some meaningful cost to the public, to taxpayers? For instance, like the organ donor pipeline issue I mentioned, like obviously it's a lot of work and money to change how that system works, but taxpayers through Medicaid are already covering billions of dollars of costs to people, and we could save a lot of money if we amended things. Another approach is trying to be creative about the money that does exist in government. So to say, and again, like looking at an agency's actual budgets, every agency has to submit a budget to the president and to OMB every year, has line items for what they're spending on, and at least being informed about what those costs look like compared to what you're advocating for. And is there an existing budget line item that you could build on, or you could add to, or you could amend an existing program to include your thing. And then I think lastly is if you can be sort of creative about, there are things that can just push your money further. Like we mentioned, prize challenges, where you're paying for success in a prize challenge, where the government says, we are interested in solving these problems. Please submit us your ideas. You can do sort of stage-gated prize challenges where everyone who submits a really viable idea or potentially viable idea, just according to some baseline metrics, will receive a small amount of money. And then you reward those few that you're more confident in once they reach a different milestone. And so you're paying for success versus a grant program where you're just paying a bunch of different vendors to go and make investments or solve some problem right off the bat. Those are some ideas. But yeah, generally it's tricky. It's tricky to figure out where the money comes from. Does that help, or is there more we should dig into there?
Perfect for me. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. And then these are just things to watch out for, things that I have seen in a lot of memos that I think are sort of cliches of memo writing, I guess. I mentioned proposals to create processes to create a proposal, telling some part of government that they need to start a process to figure out an idea to solve a problem is not really that useful. Telling some part of government we just need the president should create an interagency working group or a task force focused on X. What is the task force actually trying to deliver? And it can't, sometimes it's not the task force is going to solve the problem, but even if it's just a report, what is the point of the report? Is the report something that is going to shame someone into doing something, or some industry? Is the report what are we working backwards from in creating some kind of interagency coordination on a problem? Similar is there's a default sort of solution, which is instead of figuring out what's going on in all of the big complicated government and sub-agencies, and what if we just created a new agency to do this thing? And it's kind of shorthand for saying everything that exists couldn't possibly work. Again, sometimes that can be true. Sometimes you do need a new agency or a new sub-agency. even in the cases where that is true, it's still a good idea to have like a plan B. That's like, okay, here is obviously the best version of the idea that we're putting forward. If we can't have that, this agency that already exists has this office that should do this. Too many words, especially I think like getting too rhetorical in a policy memo. I think one thing that I observed a lot among colleagues at OSTP who came from academia was sort of a bit of a preciousness around the words that were in their memos. And the reality is that most like memos in government, what you're actually trying to do is create like paragraph chunks of information that can be easily copy pasted and not even really have any true owner, but can be duplicated across memos into, agenda items, into budget material, into State of the Union, pitches, like whatever it is. You want nuggets of words that are easily sort of like succinct and clear about different parts of your idea. Vagueness, admiring the problem. Again, this is like, it's really important to spell out what the problem is and do it concisely but compellingly with data if possible. But most of the memo should be about like, here's what we need to do about it. And like falling in love with your own ideas, just like, again, you may truly believe like we need a new agency to do X, or we need to ban this particular practice in industry. But is there a less perfect version or a different version that's also going to help solve the problem, even if all of our dreams can't come true? Okay, I think this is like similar content in a lot of ways. This is a lot of like specific policy tools. And what I'm going to do now is actually come out of this presentation and give you all this document, which has that list of specific policy tools. Let's see if I can. Okay. Oh, there's a lot of questions in the chat or comments. Hopefully we'll get to those. So here is a document I've just shared with you all, which includes a list of examples of day one successes. You can draw some inspiration from prior day one memos. This includes sort of background and some sort of like template material if you want to think about the budget piece in particular, and how to sort of include what level of information you need to include. Again, usually you don't need to go that deep in like an initial memo, but it's useful to have citations and that sort of thing too. Some template material and background on drafting executive orders. If your policy idea includes we should do an executive order on X, one thing that you can do is actually like write the draft executive order, or at least write some of the specific asks of different agencies or directives that should be included in a broader executive order. And then some considerations around authorizing legislation. If your idea does require like some kind of legislation to authorize an agency to do something. And then at the bottom of this document, which I'll also link separately in the chat, there is what we have called a workshop placemat, which includes that list that I sort of like briefly flashed by in my presentation, like a layout of a bunch of different like types of policy documents and levers and mechanisms. Things like thinking about not just legislation and regulation, rulemaking, but also other kinds of like carrots and sticks and tools that a policymaker has at their disposal. Events, public-private partnerships, investigations is obviously like a huge tool. The primary tool that we wielded at the FTC, and the resulting remedies if we felt confident enough in an investigation to move towards, either trying to win in court or to have some kind of settlement. Advisory committees and agency collaborations, like ways of coordinating movement across government. These are all like different tactics that you can employ. All right. I feel like I went a lot longer than I told you I would, Brandy. So I'll stop now. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, no worries at all. I'll have you can stop screen sharing.
Okay.
There were a couple questions that I couldn't respond to in the chat. One of them being whether or not the process for day one proposals will only occur every 4 years with a new president coming in, or does day one have calls for memos with greater frequency?
I believe our open call stays up indefinitely. I think that the organization is sort of figuring this out right now. I wasn't at FAS for the last 3 or so years while I was at the FTC, so I actually don't know if it was open during that whole period or not. There were still like a few different periods where we were definitely publishing memos, at least while I was at the FTC. So my sense is that like we're sort of in this window where we're trying to prepare as much material as possible that's targeted at the transition process. But it is not the case that like if there's a good idea that we should still potentially publish, then that opportunity is not necessarily gone. There's just probably less like institutional capacity to take a lot of memos on board at other times. Like there's a concerted effort right now across a lot of different staff trying to get stuff ready.
Great. Yes, I absolutely understand that. The idea of the policy windows.
Yeah.
So I want to pause to see if there are any additional questions. You could feel free to raise your hand and unmute or put your question directly into the chat. So I'll pause. Okay, if there are no questions right now, I know, Eric, you and I had discussed that you might talk through some of the policy memo ideas that some of our participants might have. So if we have any volunteers who are brave enough to raise their hand, we will unmute you and you can share your policy memo idea and get some direct feedback from the organization helping to spearhead this work.
I'll briefly go. Hey everyone, my name is Manar Zagul.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Manar Zagul. I'm the Health Policy Manager at the Innovative Genomics Institute, which is a research institute at UC Berkeley and UCSF. And we work mostly on cell and gene therapy. And I specifically work on affordability and access, which I know this administration and others have really focused on prescription drug pricing and sickle cell gene therapy. And I actually have to jump on another call, but maybe I just wanted to float. I mean, there's a lot of different issues in the cell and gene therapy space and around patient access and affordability. I guess my question is a little bit more general. I have a couple of different ideas of what could be done from a policy perspective, but some of which are probably heavier lifts, like, asking Congress to establish a translation-focused funding agency like what we have in California, which is called the CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which is a funding agency that specifically funds clinical trials. And at the federal level, we don't have that, which means that we actually spend a lot of money, investor dollars, as well as taxpayer funds into basically goes down what we call the valley of death, which is so we do a lot of research and then we don't have a whole lot of data up front of whether that will work. And eventually funds will dry out and things just sit on shelves because there's not enough funding to move forward with clinical trials. CIRM is trying to do this on a California level, spending billions of dollars to do this. But a federal agency could, or a federally based funding pot of money would be obviously game changing in the space. That would be, really heavy ask of Congress, especially if Congress is split. But you could also envision, smaller things like, okay, you could go after maybe asking FDA to make regulations more streamlined for certain aspects of the development pipeline. I guess my question is, how do you choose between the really big asks or that could be transformative or smaller things that would maybe move the needle just a little bit?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think there's a few different things to consider. One is, of course, you can always write a memo that says, here is a set of options that would advance or improve innovation in X. So it can be an agenda for unlocking, gene therapies for more American, or creating more equitable access for gene therapy or something along those lines, I guess would be your frame. And then you would present different options or courses of action that could be taken. You don't need to just have one recommendation in a memo, and you don't need to be completely, I guess confident and committed to any particular action. You can say in the memo, there are sort of pros and cons to each of these approaches, or obviously some things may be more difficult to achieve. I think another thing to consider is which of the ideas you personally are have the deepest ability to speak to and know about, where there may be sort of this high level of investment that you're calling for that's sort of broad and ambitious. And that may be genuinely, it could be the thing that you're you've already thought a lot about, or you want to think a lot about. Or it could be here is a specific existing program. I actually don't know if ARPA-H is doing stuff around gene therapies for particular rare diseases. It's plausible that they are. And you could say...
They are in some capacity.
Okay. So, and to look at what they're doing and to say, hey, this is good, but there are some things that are not being addressed, or here are some other things that they should be funding, or something that's more targeted towards something that exists already. And just depending on both your sort of expertise capacity, just thinking also about the more ideas you propose, the more research you're going to have to do, the more you're going to have to become an expert in more parts of government, that sort of thing too.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. I have to drop off, but really appreciate the presentation, the workshop series. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for sharing your idea. I see another idea here in the chat from Avi. Let me float a hypothetical. Traffic engineering and city planning should be incentivized to favor the guidelines in walkable cities and disincentivize guidelines produced by vehicle manufacturers. How can we get that moving?
Incentivize. Yeah, so I think the questions are right now, what are the existing, mapping out the existing incentives that exist for traffic engineering and city planning, and who is responsible for those incentives? Is there, I assume most of that happens at the state and local level, but if there are incentives by the Department of Transportation, then, is it a question of an existing set of standards or requirements that they have in grants that they give to states and cities? Do those grants necessarily allow for too much flexibility, or do they not allow for the right flexibility? Is there a way of creating different parameters around grants from federal entities? Maybe it's Department of Transportation, maybe it's someone else that is relevant to state, local, city planners that would incentivize something different? Is it a matter of incentivizing and I'm not super deep on how those guidelines are put together. And so that would just be the question, is who's responsible and what incentive are they responding to? And is there some federal lever in terms of who gets money and why to do these processes is probably where I would start.
Thank you. And Avi, thank you so much for putting in your idea there. And I'm happy that you touched on the money, Eric. If I've learned one thing over the years, is that if you can find the funding mechanisms that are leading to incentives and disincentives and convincingly argue for a change, the money talks, for better or for worse. So I'm really happy that you touched on that. All right. Anybody else want to present their idea? We can probably take just one more. Okay, it seems maybe the others aren't quite ready to share, but in workshop 3, we will work with you to flesh out your policy memo idea. We will also help you submit your application form for consideration to the Day One Project at next Friday's meeting. Eric, thank you so much for this overview of FAS and the Day One Project and how to write a very effective policy memo. We're incredibly grateful. And now I'm going to present some additional insights into broader impacts and strategies for academics. So thank you so much, Eric, for joining today.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. Thank you all. Excited to see some submissions. Have a good Friday.
Thank you. All right, everybody. I know I have mostly academics here. So one thing I wanted to touch on in today's workshop is how you can identify the broader impact strategies for your federal grant making proposals. I'm sure many of you who have already submitted or are currently or may submit a grant to a federal agency, you're aware of broader impacts. But what we want to talk about today are what are those broader impacts and what does that include? Oftentimes, broader impacts, we immediately think of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is extremely important. But there are additional broader impacts that are under the scope for these federal agencies. And I'll give you a list of some examples today. Next Friday, with this video of this training, we will release the Broader Impacts Toolkit produced by the CITRIS Policy Lab. This will serve as a resource for helping you to translate your research into those broader policy impacts. It will provide resources, including resources for our 4 CITRIS-affiliated campuses, UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Merced, and UC Santa Cruz. So if you're a principal investigator on that campus, this toolkit is especially made just for you. So what are broader impacts? Well, federal grant-making agencies, they define broader impacts as the societal benefits of research. Now, for public policy, this often means connecting your research to potential legislation or regulatory changes or policy initiatives. The FAS-funded ARIS project, the Center for Advancing Research Impact in Society, provides guidance on those potential broader impacts outcomes. This list is not exhaustive. This is a high-level list. First, again, addressing those diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging goals, full participation of women, persons with disabilities, and underrepresented minorities. Another, improved education and educator development, increased public engagement, improved well-being of individuals in society, development of a diverse, globally competitive workforce, increased partnerships between academia, industry, and others, improved national security. Now, you might say, I understand the implications of that. Now, national security is quite often a bipartisan issue. And so framing, if your work is relevant to national security, that is something that it could be a lot easier to get buy-in on both sides of the aisle, as it is typically bipartisan. Increase economic competitiveness of the United States. And last, what's very important, especially to all of us here, enhance infrastructure for research and education. But what are some of the specific policy broader impacts? So some key policy related broader impacts include informing public policy and decision making. Can your research help to inform a bill that is proposed in the Congress or a bill proposed in the California legislature? Another is contributing to public understanding of science and technology. Our CITRIS Policy Lab hosted video and podcast series TecHype does exactly this. We strive to debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies and the laws and policies that shape them so that we can better ensure that our public is empowered in this ever-evolving digital world. Also enhancing public safety, health, and well-being, and promoting responsible use of technology and addressing ethical considerations. I am sure a lot of you here are grappling with, I'm very focused on my research and testing my hypotheses, answering my research questions. It seems very difficult for me right now to think about and identify these policy broader impacts. We're here to help. We will help you do this in workshops 3 and 4. First is mapping out your policy stakeholders. Identify government agencies, regulatory bodies, industry, civil society, community organizations, any stakeholder that would be interested in or affected by your research topic. Now, that's very important because when you map out those stakeholders, you can better understand their own incentives and their power to actually affect the change that you are calling for. If you're calling for a bill to have amended language, the individual who drafted the bill is one of your primary stakeholders. You would want to understand, well, why did they draft the bill? What are their main concerns? And how might I present this amendment or revision to them that can help them better see that this amendment is going to help achieve that spirit of the bill that they have written? Next is connecting to existing policy. How does your research already align with current laws? Does it provide stronger interpretation that can be used to uphold a law? For example, there's a lot of research coming out of a team at UC Berkeley on how to verify and validate that your personally identifiable information has been removed from a platform in alignment with the California Consumer Privacy Act and the California Privacy Rights Act. That research really provides a lot of assistance to the state so that they can actually verify and validate that those companies are following the law that they're required to follow. You can also contribute to existing policies or regulations from federal and state agencies, but also identifying policy gaps. So let's go back to that example again of implementation of the California Consumer Privacy Act and the California Privacy Rights Act. Well, one of the policy gaps is how to technically demonstrate that the companies are compliant. And your research, if you were working in this space, would fill that gap and really empower the California Attorney General to understand that and compare and hold those companies accountable. Last, long-term societal benefits, considering how your research could support sustainability, equity, or resilience in society. And you'll see healthcare, transportation, information technology. There are also agencies that directly work in all of these spaces, which would be one of those key stakeholders you would want to engage with. Now, the essential components of policy broader impacts. The first, of course, is societal relevance. In your proposals, you need to clearly articulate how the research addresses those societal challenges, particularly in policy areas, like public health, climate change, AI governance, environmental sustainability. We're an academic institution. All of our work is very relevant to society, so this is not quite a challenge for us. but making those connections and clearly articulating how our research is of great importance to society. Next, targeted outcomes. It can't just be sort of pie in the sky broad. We need to ban plastics around the world, but you have to be more specific. What are specific potential policy outcomes that I can do that will influence my final goal? Can I influence bills or regulations, or can I even just improve decision-making processes in government on this very thorny, challenging issue? Next, measurable impacts. Provide a framework for actually assessing the impact of your research on policy. To go back to the example of the CCPA, CPRA, our California Consumer Privacy Act, you can demonstrate that by utilizing this tool and empowering the public to verify and validate that their personally identifiable information has been removed from a platform, well, that empowers them to be able to report that, to say, yes, it has been removed or it hasn't been removed. It's measurable. We can actually see whether or not those companies are being compliant. Another is collaboration with policymakers. And this is very important about describing plans for your engagement with policymakers during and after your research. In your proposal, you might say, we're going to be consulting with policymakers on, that sit on particular committees of relevance to this issue to better understand what are the questions they're grappling with and how does our research or the research of our colleagues fill that void for them. That could also be presented to them as a policy brief or a policy memo. Quickly, you might have heard us interchange policy brief and policy memo during today's presentation. These are indeed two different things. A policy memo is much, much more pithy than a policy brief. Policy memo is usually 1 to 2 pages that bluff right at the top, bottom line up front. What do you want them to do? And some supporting evidence. A policy brief is longer. Again, always bluff, bottom line up front. You're engaging with individuals who have way too many meetings in one day. So you want them to be able to act on exactly what you're saying. You can provide supporting evidence that supports why they should do that. But then also in a policy brief, you can provide more nuance into, I've considered these alternatives that are being proposed in this space, and this is why they may fall short. And this is why the strategy that we have outlined is the one that you should pursue. I would recommend something like a policy brief for a topic that might be more technical or has, many more barriers to being implemented, just to provide that additional evidence to your decision makers so that they can act on your recommendation. Now, let's talk about types of deliverables. Today, and I've just compared policy memos and policy briefs. Now, the policy memo, which the FAS Day One Project is soliciting ideas from all of you, which I hope you will all seriously consider applying to this opportunity. It's a great way for your research that you have worked so hard on to be put into the hands of those decision makers who can act on it and operationalize it. Policy memos, again, are these short evidence-based documents. They target a specific policy challenge and offer actionable recommendations right at the beginning. The second is providing testimony in a hearing. You could present your research findings to legislative or regulatory bodies or advisory councils, demonstrating to them the issue and what should be done. Another is producing white papers. These are more in-depth. These can outline those policy implications of your research findings, and this can be very helpful for stakeholders within government agencies, especially those where additional information is very helpful in the context of their regulatory scope. The example we heard earlier about the FDA, a white paper on this specific challenge that was presented earlier, outlining the shortcomings and what can be done and how the agency can act on that recommendation. That would be very helpful also in a white paper. And workshops and briefings. Members of Congress and members of legislatures, the California legislature, they are very interested in engaging with academia, because academia, we have that core technical expertise and experience to be able to cut through oftentimes hype or misunderstanding around these really thorny societal challenges for them to be able to better understand the issue and form appropriate guidance. I wanted to also note that there are several resources that are available to all of you. So on each of your campuses, you have your campus office of government and community relations. They are your go-to person for engaging with members of Congress and the California legislature. They've oftentimes built up years of experience with those individuals. So I would definitely encourage you, if you have identified a member of Congress or a member of the California legislature that's working on a topic of relevance to your work, reach out to your Office of Government and Community Relations, ask them to help introduce you because they have that rapport built up, and it can lead to a greater success rate of being able to get that meeting one-on-one with the individual. Also, reaching out to your policy-focused departments and units on campus. Those entities that are thinking about shaping public policy. So for at Berkeley, that would be the Goldman School of Public Policy. And there are other policy focus centers across CITRIS. Well, I'm going to highlight our CITRIS campuses, Berkeley, Davis, Merced, and Santa Cruz. As I showed you before, our toolkit, we will have resources in there for each of the 4 campuses. Another, reaching out to research centers and units across campus. By nature, they are often interdisciplinary. And I would note that when you're thinking about the policy impacts of your work, it is often from an interdisciplinary lens, right? You're not just thinking about the technical mechanism that you're developing, but how that technical mechanism addresses a pressing societal challenge. Of course, engaging with the community that will be affected and ensuring that your solution is in alignment with their actual needs and wants. News is a great resource for seeing what's popping up in this space. Is there going to be a notice of proposed rulemaking? Is there a CEO of a company who is facing some scrutiny on this issue? And right now, what we would call in the public policy space a window, because everybody's talking about it. Let's say Zuckerberg is being called to testify before Congress on online child safety, and you work in online child safety. Now's your window because everybody's thinking about it and talking about it. And this is when you can really deliver your work. And also keeping an eye on relevant bills or hearings that are happening. At the federal level, you can see that at congress.gov. You can also sign up to track certain pieces of legislation or just by topical area. So I track artificial intelligence, of course. And then there's also the leginfo.legislature.ca.gov for the California legislature. Again, I wanted to remind everybody that the CITRIS Policy Lab is here to support you. We have a variety of services where we can help you think through those public policy, broader impacts of your research and help you translate your research into actionable deliverables that can affect change. Our upcoming workshops, Workshop 3, Pitching the President, Providing Effective Guidance to Policymakers, and our writing workshop, where we will sort of brainstorm our ideas and submit them to the FAS Day One Project, is next week. You'll please note that, not next week, I'm sorry, it's on Friday, November 8th. We're taking a little break. Friday, November 8th, 10 to 12 p.m., a 2-hour session, because we will be writing together and working. So I know all of us have too many meetings in a week. So we thought what would be helpful is just to do one long meeting, get everything done there and submitted so that you can be more efficient. And then Workshop 4, Engaging with the Legislative and Regulatory Processes. How do you effectively provide comments on notices of proposed rulemaking from federal agencies? How do you respond to a request for information from an agency or a request for comment? We will walk through the entire process with you so that you will be empowered to be able to respond in a quick way to those notices. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us today for the Science Communication and Policy Impact Workshop Series. Please register for our upcoming workshops at citruspolicylab.org/SCPI workshops. Thank you all for joining.